The 5-minute delay. The silence of a building at 3 a.m. isn't actually silent. If you listen closely, it's a symphony of mechanical groans. The hum of the industrial HVAC system, the rhythmic clicking of the server room, and the occasional settling of concrete. After 3 years of working the night shift at the industrial park outside Tangier, I've learned to interpret every sound. But tonight, the building is speaking a language I don't recognize. My station is a small, glass-walled pod in the center of the lobby. It's a fishbowl of fluorescent light surrounded by an ocean of shadows. To stay awake, I usually do my rounds every hour, but tonight, the fog outside is so thick it feels like the building is floating in a void. I found a box in the basement earlier, marked Surveillance Archive 1998, and brought it up to my desk to pass the time. Inside was a single, dusty VHS player and one unmarked tape. I hooked it up to the old monitor, expecting grainy footage of empty hallways. When the screen flickered to life, the image was surprisingly sharp. I froze. The screen showed the security pod, my desk, the small pile of paperwork I hadn't finished. It showed me, sitting in my chair, looking at the monitor. I waved my hand slowly. On the screen, the me in the video didn't move. He just sat there, staring intently at the screen. I looked at the timestamp in the corner of the footage. It was 3:15 a.m. I looked at my watch. It was 3:10 a.m. A cold shiver raced down my spine, settling in the small of my back. I wasn't watching a recording. I was watching the future. I watched the future me on the screen for several minutes. He looked tired, rubbing his eyes, just as I felt the urge to do so. It was a perfect mirror, delayed by exactly 5 minutes. Then, on the screen, something changed. In the background of the video, the heavy steel door to the north stairwell, the one right behind my left shoulder, slowly began to creak open. Real time, 3:12 a.m. I turned around. The door behind me was shut tight, locked. I looked back at the screen. On the tape, a hand emerged from the darkness of the stairwell. It was pale, with fingers that were far too long gripping the edge of the steel door. A figure began to lean out. It was tall, dressed in a tattered dark coat, but it had no face, just a smooth, blurred surface where features should be. On the screen, the future me was still looking at the monitor, unaware. I watched in a trance of horror as the figure drifted toward the back of my chair. It moved with a sickening, fluid grace, like ink moving through water. It stopped directly behind me. It raised a long, spindly hand and hovered it just inches above my head. I looked at my watch, 3:14 a.m. I have 60 seconds. I can hear the real door behind me now, the heavy click of the latch, the slow, rhythmic groan of the hinges. I am staring at the screen, and the figure on the tape is looking directly into the camera now, as if it knows I'm watching from the past. It's smiling. I can't see a mouth, but I know it's smiling. 3:15 a.m. The door behind me is wide open. The cold draft from the stairwell has finally reached my neck. I don't want to turn around, because if the tape is right, it's already too late. The echo in the gym. The gym at night is a different world. During the day, it's a place of sweat, loud music, and the clanking of iron. But after midnight, when I'm finishing my solo training session in the basement of this old building, the atmosphere shifts. The air grows heavy, and the mirrors, wall-to-wall glass designed to track your form, become something much more sinister. I was hitting the heavy bag, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of my gloves, the only sound in the room. I've spent years training in kickboxing, and I'm used to the exhaustion, the heavy breathing, and the focus. But tonight, I felt like my rhythm was off. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against the cold leather of the bag. That's when I heard it, a single muffled thud. It came from the cardio room upstairs, a single footstep on a treadmill. I froze, listening. Maybe it was a malfunction or the building settling. I took a sip of water, trying to ignore the sudden chill in the room. I started a set of shadow boxing in front of the main mirror. My movements were sharp, familiar, left jab, right cross, slip. But as I watched my reflection, I realized something was wrong. My reflection was a fraction of a second behind. It was subtle, barely a heartbeat of a delay, but when I dropped my hands, the me in the mirror kept his guard up for a split second longer. I stopped moving entirely. I stared into my own eyes in the reflection. My reflection didn't stare back. Instead, it slowly turned its head to look at the dark corner of the gym behind me. There was nothing there but a row of unused weights and a stack of black yoga mats. Then, the reflection smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth. Suddenly, the sound of a treadmill upstairs roared to life. It wasn't the sound of a machine starting. It was the sound of someone running at a full, desperate sprint. The floorboards above me groaned under the weight of a heavy, pounding pace. Thump, 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 thump. The sound was moving toward the stairs, toward the basement. I looked back at the mirror. The me inside was no longer standing. He was pressed against the glass from the other side, his hands flat against the surface, his face twisted in a silent scream. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was pointing. He was pointing at the door to the basement, which was slowly, silently swinging open. I'm a fighter. I know how to defend myself against a man. But as the lights in the gym began to flicker and die one by one, leaving me in total darkness, I realized that you can't strike what isn't solid, and you can't run from something that is already waiting for you in the dark. The sound in the walls. There is a specific kind of quiet that only exists in the Moroccan countryside after the wind dies down. It's not a peaceful silence. It's a heavy, expectant one, like the earth is holding its breath. I moved to this small house outside of Tetuan to find peace from my writing, away from the city noise. For the first week, the only sound was the occasional bark of a stray dog. Then, the scratching started. It began at 2 a.m., a light, rhythmic tapping behind the headboard of my bed. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like fingernails on dry wood. I told myself it was mice or the house settling in the night cold. I'd knock back on the wall and the sound would stop instantly. Silence would return, thick and suffocating. By the fourth night, the tapping changed. It didn't stop when I knocked. Instead, it mimicked me. If I knocked twice, it knocked twice. If I scratched the wallpaper, it scratched back from the other side. But there was no other side. Behind that wall was nothing but 3 feet of solid stone and the open night air. I decided to investigate the exterior of the house with a flashlight. The stone was smooth, ancient, and unbroken. No holes for rodents, no branches scraping the side. But as I stood outside in the shivering cold, I heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. It wasn't coming from inside the wall anymore. It was coming from inside my head. I ran back indoors and locked the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I sat in the middle of the kitchen, the furthest point from my bedroom. I sat there for hours, staring at the shadows, waiting for the sun. The house was deathly still. Then, I heard a soft, wet thud from the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the floor. A small pile of dirt was sitting on the rug, as if it had fallen from the ceiling. I looked up. There was a thin crack in the plaster that hadn't been there before, and then a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't a tap, it was a whisper.
"I like the way you knock," the voice said. It was thin, like paper tearing, and it came from directly behind me. "It sounds just like your mother did." "I live alone. My mother has been gone for 10 years. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because as I looked at my shadow on the kitchen wall, I saw a second shadow standing right next to mine. It was taller, thinner, and its hand was slowly reaching out to knock on the back of my skull.
The fog on the street. There's a specific kind of lighthouse on the coast near Tangier that hasn't been manned in decades. It sits on a jagged tooth of rock, staring out at the Strait of Gibraltar. People say the currents there are treacherous, but the locals know it's not the water you should fear, it's the fog. I was out late, finishing a 14-kilometer run along the coastal path. The air was unusually still, the Mediterranean flat like a sheet of dark glass. A thick, rhythmic fog began to roll in, swallowing the horizon, then the beach, then the path beneath my feet. Within minutes, I was running through a white void. I slowed to a walk, my breath coming in shallow hitches. That's when I heard the bell, a low, bronze chime echoing across the water. Clang, clang. It was steady, hypnotic, and seemingly miles away. But with every step I took toward home, the bell sounded closer. I stopped. The bell stopped. I took 3 quick steps. 3 metal chimes rang out in perfect synchronization with my footsteps. It wasn't a bell on a buoy or a distant ship. Something was mimicking the vibration of my feet hitting the earth. I turned my head, squinting into the white haze. A shape began to form in the fog. It was thin, towering, perhaps 7 feet tall, standing perfectly still on the edge of the cliffside. It held a long, rusted chain in its hand, and at the end of that chain swung a heavy, salt-crusted bell. "Is someone there?" I called out. My voice felt small, eaten by the mist. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to walk. But it didn't walk toward me. It walked in a wide, slow circle, dragging the bell across the wet stones. The sound was like a knife scraping a plate. As it circled, the fog grew even thicker, pressing against my skin like wet wool. I realized then that I couldn't see the path anymore. I couldn't even see my own hands. The scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy it made my ears ring. Then, a voice whispered from the fog, not from the direction of the figure, but from directly beneath my feet. "The tide is coming in," the voice murmured. It sounded like water bubbling in a throat. "And we've been waiting for a new clapper for the bell." I looked down. The ground beneath me wasn't stone anymore. I was standing on a pile of sun-bleached bones, thousands of them, stacked high against the cliff. I felt a cold, wet hand wrap around my ankle. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just watched as the tall figure stepped out of the fog, its face a hollow shell filled with seawater, and raised the heavy bronze bell above my head. The last thing I heard was the most beautiful, calmest chime I had ever known.